1 year ago today, on the 16th of October 2019, my mum died. For 4 years she suffered from cancer, originating as an uncommon form of breast cancer known as IBC or Inflammatory Breast Cancer. I'm going to use this video to tell you about my mum. Not just her cancer, but her life before. I also want to use this as an opportunity to educate about inflammatory breast cancer, as it is often overlooked or misdiagnosed, as in my mum's case. I feel my mum's experience makes this somewhat my duty. I want to make this clear. This is my opinion, how I see things, and how I experience them. Nothing in this video is the opinion of another, and may not truly reflect the feelings and opinions of others that knew my mum. Born in 1966, Lisa Bird, then Lisa Page, my mum, was the youngest of 5, and the only girl. This to me is probably why she came off slightly more boyish than other mums. She certainly wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. In my recollection, she didn't speak too much about her relationship with her brothers until later in her life. For me, I've always found it strange how your opinion of someone can be easily clouded by your parents' opinion of them. I know that my mum wanted to be a vet when she was young, but she left school in order to pursue a career at a fish and chip shop. Something she always made clear to me that she had regretted. She would have made a good vet. She had multiple jobs throughout her life, things I can remember including broidering logos onto work uniforms, picking mushrooms, and working in a preschool, even being a cleaner at the local B&Q in the shopping arcade. Not all jobs that some might have been proud to have had, but that never mattered to me or my mum. It kept us kids clothed and fed, and that's all that mattered. She met my dad young, and married him at 20. That unfortunately was only to last 16 years. But that was long enough to have brought me and my younger brother and sister into existence. She tried hard to have children, losing 2 to miscarriage before finally having a successful birth with me. 3 years later, and after some pressure from my nan pleading with her to give me a little sister, my brother was born. 4 years after that, my sister was born. A happy accident, not one I was ever explained the circumstances around, but a happy accident nonetheless. My mum liked chicken tikka masala with chips. Not rice. She didn't like rice. She liked rich tea biscuits dipped in a cup of Tetley tea with 2 sweeteners in. She liked Parma violets, Terry's chocolate orange, and Thornton's special toffee. Sometimes she might knit or cross-stitch. She'd play games on the Game Boy and later on her phone. She'd watch all of the reality TV. Big Brother, Celebrity Jungle, X Factor. She loved it. EastEnders was another big one for her. Thanks, Mum, for all the help in pub quizzes and general knowledge rounds on TV quiz shows. I find it quite peculiar that families of deceased people often make out their loved ones to be absolute angels, brilliant people who never put a foot wrong. Somehow the full truth of that person disappears with their death. I don't want to do this for my mum. Not to say that she was by any means a bad person in any way. I certainly don't remember her doing anything bad purposefully. But she, like the rest of us, was not a perfect person. She had regrets and made mistakes. But for me, the big thing she never got wrong were her priorities when it came to her children. I know full well that there were times during my childhood that my mum went hungry in order to make sure there was food on the table for us kids. And we never went hungry, not once. We didn't always get everything we wanted, but we always got everything we needed, and for me, that's all down to my mum. We certainly were not a privileged family, but it took me well into my teens to realise just how much we had struggled throughout my childhood. I never once felt poor, or that I didn't have as much as my friends or the people around me. And none of this is because my mum ever tried to hide the truth from us, but because she did everything in her power to make sure that we had everything that we needed. For me, a major example of all this is one Christmas. My mum plunged herself into £1,000 worth of credit card debt purely to make sure that we had a good Christmas. Maybe this shows lack of forethought because of the effect on her credit, or the fact that she'd struggled for years to pay the debt off, but this didn't matter in the moment. The most important thing to us kids is that we got a good Christmas, and we did. That year we got everything we wanted. It's also worth mentioning my mum worked hard, even until well after her diagnosis, in order to pay off this and all the other debts she had, up until the point where she left us with no debts to pay from her estate. There is more that I can say about my mum, even memories and funny moments that I can share, but I don't feel it's necessary. All I wanted to do by telling you any of this is to show you that my mum was far more than the cancer that unfortunately ended her life. I feel that for a lot of people, be it a terminal disease or other disability, they end up becoming their ailment and have it consume their personality. Perhaps it did for my mum towards the end, but for me, my mum was much more than the terrible disease that consumed her. My mum's diagnosis came in late 2015. I don't personally remember the point at which she told me of the actual diagnosis, but that's my fault. I had things going on in my life that I should have had more control of. I do remember, however, my mum telling me on a phone call that she had a pain in her left breast and that she was going to see the doctor about it. She never really explained more than that to me until later on, and not because she didn't feel like it was appropriate to discuss it with me. My mum would happily talk about all sorts of things like that. There was very little factor of not a conversation between a mother and son. Afterwards, I've always been told that she had a rash of some kind, some redness, and a dull pain in her breast. The doctor didn't immediately realise it was cancer and prescribed a steroid ointment. This is not at all the fault of the doctor, it's very unknown that these are signs of cancer. After a couple of weeks of applying the ointment and it only getting worse, she went back to visit the doctor, at which point a deeper investigation was performed, which is what eventually found the cancer. From there came the radio and chemotherapies. Each time after that I saw my mum was different. Some days were good, other days were bad, but most obvious of all, she was getting more and more tired. Sometimes it was easier to see than others. One time she'd not want to get out of bed, the next time she wanted to go out and do something. My brother and sister have a completely different view of these events. Living at home with her, they were able to see the changes day on day. For me, I only had the opportunity to visit at most once every 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes I could go more often, but sometimes it was longer. I always said the cancer would not change the relationship me and my mum had, and for the most part it didn't. My less often visits were part of this. What this meant for me is that the changes in my mum's health were more stark for me than they were for my siblings. For me, a lot changed on the 8th of July in 2016. I was at a music festival, and in all honesty I was not completely with it. My mum called me, and I walked away from the music so that I could hear her. She told me the cancer had gotten to the point where it would eventually kill her. She explained that although she might be cancer-free at some point, the doctor had explained that it would come back and it would eventually be a cause of death. I can't remember if it was at this point or later on that we were told we'd be lucky to have 5 years. I remember composing myself and trying to get my head straight with everything that was going on. It took me a couple of minutes, but I decided I wasn't going to let this change anything. I carried on, I walked back to the stage and carried on enjoying my weekend. I didn't even tell any of my friends until we had got back from the music festival, and perhaps in hindsight this was not the best thing to have done in the moment, but for me it felt right, and I'm not going to live my life in regret of that weekend. It may be worth mentioning that by this point the cancer had spread from the lymph node in her armpit, which is where inflammatory breast cancer starts, and into the lymph nodes in her neck. She had a single mastectomy and later had a small operation in the node in her armpit, but it still managed to spread to her brain. She had a surgery to remove the tumour from her brain, which in my opinion has the coolest name of any surgery in existence, cyberknife. The cyberknife was successful in removing the cancer from her brain, but it was unfortunately still spreading in the rest of her body. No matter how much chemo she had, how many different ones she tried, it still kept spreading. Some chemos would slow the spread and the growth, some would stop it, but would make her ill or tired, and it simply wasn't worth the side effects. It's also worth noting you can only take a certain amount of most chemo drugs, so sometimes even if something is working, you still have to stop it. Whatever her doctors tried, nothing was stopping the inevitable, just prolonging it. I completely understand my mum repeatedly stressing her wanting to give up the chemo multiple times. Everything she was trying to make herself better was making her more ill, and all it was doing was prolonging the time she felt ill for. I cannot at this point blame my mum one bit for wanting to stop the chemo. I remember at one point telling my mum that I'd be disappointed if she didn't try everything possible in order to have all the time she could get, and for that I feel somewhat guilty. By telling her that, I was just being selfish, stretching out my mum's life that she was too ill to enjoy, just so that me and my family could have her around for a bit longer. She listened though, she did try everything. I'm pretty sure she tried a bit of every chemotherapy available. My mum attended a day hospice every Thursday at the fantastic St Richard's Hospice, an amazing organisation that could not have done more to help me, my mum or my family. This gave my mum the opportunity to socialise with a bunch of people and also a chance to take part in craft activities which she enjoyed a lot. My mum had been unwell and had spent a few weeks in the hospital. She'd only been out a couple of weeks when she had felt well enough to attend the day hospice. A doctor at the hospice saw her and noticed how unwell she still was and asked her to stay at the hospice for a few nights, so that they would be able to keep an eye on her. Little did anybody know that within 8 short weeks she'd be dead. At first my mum loved staying at the hospice, but soon she became very homesick and decided that although it was a lovely place to be, she didn't want to be at the hospice. It just didn't feel like home. She just wanted to be at her home, on her own sofa, with her dogs, in front of her own TV, dipping rich teas in a cuppa from her own kettle. There's nothing wrong with the hospice. I've always compared it to a nice hotel. The rooms are lovely and the garden is unbelievably beautiful. Without being too crass, it's an amazing place to die. After a few weeks in the hospice, my mum had an appointment with the doctor at the hospital. I went with her. The doctor made it clear things were not looking good, and that he was stopping her last course of chemo. He said he'd book another appointment for 8 weeks' time, and we'd see if my mum felt well enough to go to that appointment. She wouldn't even make it those 8 weeks. For me, it felt obvious that the doctor was doubting we'd make the appointment, but I don't think my mum saw it that way. Perhaps she was too tired to fully comprehend what he was saying. Strangely, it wasn't upsetting being at that appointment. It felt to me like it was an inevitable part of everything that was happening. The next few weeks were strange. A rota of different family and friends turning up to see her, people coming out of the woodwork that hadn't spoken to her in years, such an incredibly fake thing. They didn't care for the 5 years that she was ill, but the second she's dying they need to visit. She went from 1 week wanting to go out to eat, to visit town and to leave the hospice. The next week it was obvious to everyone but my mum that this just wasn't going to happen. My mum kept talking about wanting to go home, at first to stay at home, but then it became just a visit. My mum had mentioned to me that she wanted a new jacket and a new hairbrush, so on a Wednesday I had a day off work and me and my girlfriend took her into town and found all the things that she wanted to buy. I had to push her in a wheelchair, so she wasn't great, but she was fairly with it and lucid. As we walked around town she got more and more tired. We had to return her to the hospice at around 6 o'clock to have her driver refilled. This is a machine that automatically delivers pain medication. Me and my girlfriend were planning to go for a meal after this and asked my mum's doctors if she'd be able to come if she felt like it. Her doctors said it was fine if she wanted to, which she said she did. We went to a restaurant very close to the hospice. It was obvious once we were there that it was not a great choice. My mum was out of it, far too tired. She struggled to even choose food to order. Once the food came, she didn't eat much of it. In hindsight, this was far too much. It took a lot out of my mum, and was in my mind at the start of a steep slope. My mum had been repeatedly requesting to go home. By this point she had realised that she could only visit home and not return there for good. On that Friday the doctors gave my mum the go-ahead, and they were able to take her home for a while. The doctors went with her for her safety. Before they did, the doctors had all the immediate family gather so they could speak with us. They explained in no uncertain terms that if she was to go home it might be pretty much the last thing she does. We made the decision that since it was the one thing my mum was asking for the most, that we'd let her go. It didn't make any sense to deny her last trip home. I wasn't able to be there, but from what I hear she simply sat on the sofa with her dogs and had a cup of tea. That was all she wanted to go home for. It all makes sense. She didn't know that she wasn't going home when she went into the hospice, and I suppose she just wanted to see home for one last time. The following Monday in the evening I visited my mum. At this point she was mumbling, but hardly communicating. I went home and went to bed, but didn't get much sleep, as what was happening was obvious. At around 2 o'clock in the morning I had a call from a nurse at the hospice. She explained she'd been watching my mum, and she'd gotten seemingly a lot worse than when I'd visited earlier. She explained she didn't think she was dying immediately and not to rush to the hospice, but I wasn't getting much sleep anyway, so me and my girlfriend headed over. Once we arrived I phoned my brother and sister to explain what was happening. Over the course of that Tuesday my whole family visited. At one point all 4 of her brothers and my granddad were there, which was nice to see. All my mum's close friends came, and even my dad and stepmum came to support me and my siblings. Everyone else, apart from me, my girlfriend, my brother, his girlfriend and my sister left. The hospice has a great facility of 2 family rooms, which honestly were amazingly well outfitted and an amazing place to stay. My brother and his girlfriend shared a room, whilst my girlfriend shared a room with my sister. I stayed on a camp bed in the room with my mum. I kept being woken up by the nurses checking on my mum every 30 minutes, but I didn't mind as it gave me a chance to check on her myself. At around 7 in the morning a nurse woke me up and said she was worried about my health as I hadn't got any proper sleep, and suggested I swap out shifts with another member of my family. I agreed that this was a good idea. I approached my mum, knowing that if I was to go and sleep in one of the family rooms, the likelihood was that next time I saw my mum she would be gone. I told my mum out loud that I loved her, and I explained that we're all just now waiting for her. I told her that I know it's hard, but if she was to go now, we could all get some rest. I promised her that we'd all had long enough, and that it was hard to see her suffer. I left the room to awake my sister. Both my sister and my girlfriend woke up, and my sister went into the room with my mum. She came straight back out saying, "I think she's gone." She was. My mum had waited all night for me to leave that room, and the moment she was alone was the time she chose to go. The next few hours were a blur, from being understandably upset to being unspeakably angry at the actions of some certain others. As a small family group, we spent a lot of time over the next 2 weeks together, which was strange for us. We never usually see each other that much, but it was nice to be together for those 2 weeks. I feel that something most people don't discuss is the stress that comes with planning a funeral. There are a lot of people there to help, but there are others that seem to just want to cause me more stress. Somewhat luckily, my mum had already done a lot of the planning for her own funeral. She knew who she wanted to speak, she knew the music she wanted, she even told us some of the people she didn't particularly want at her funeral. After all the stress, however, the funeral went well, and the wake was a good time for everyone that attended. For me, dealing with my mum's death has been easier than I expected. And that's not to say I haven't grieved. I was upset at first, and I spent a long time angry at people I had no need to be angry at. I hope they've accepted the apologies I've given them. Personally, having 4 years where we knew my mum was dying gave me the opportunity to prepare for what eventually came. The possible only positive outcome to come from this 2020 lockdown for me has been the opportunity to spend time to deal with the grief in my own way on my own time. And for me, making this video is part of that whole process. I don't really feel sorry for myself for all this. The people I feel worse for are my uncles, who I'm sure never imagined they'd ever have to attend their little sister's funeral, especially so soon, but worst of all is my granddad. I genuinely believe that no parent should ever have to see their child die, no matter what age they are. My granddad is a very healthy man for an 89-year-old, and will continue to be with us for a fair few more years, I can imagine. I can't believe he's ever imagined he'd have to attend any of his children's funerals, especially his youngest's. There is also my nephew, born in April. My mum knew my brother and his girlfriend were pregnant, but unfortunately never lived to meet him. She'd have loved him, and I'm sure he'd have loved her. Although I trust my brother and his girlfriend to do all they can to make sure my young nephew knows exactly who his nan was, I find it a pity they never got to meet. My mum died on October the 16th in 2019, at 53 years of age, in the amazing care of St. Richard's Hospice. She may not have led the perfect, regretless life, she may not have done all the things she wanted to do, but for me, she did the best at the one thing that mattered most to me, being a mum. Breast cancer is not always a lump, and it certainly wasn't in my mum's case. Even the doctor didn't realise it was breast cancer. IBC is just that unknown. Everyone is always taught to search their breasts for lumps, but never taught the dangers of redness, pains and changes in the skin. For my mum, it was purely a rash on the left side of her left breast near the armpit, and later found a tenderness in her armpit. This was obviously the cancer in her lymph node. More recently, the teaching has changed to say to see your doctor about any changes in the breast, but this doesn't change all the years that people have been repeatedly told to only look for lumps. Inflammatory breast cancer is far worse than other types of breast cancer. As a comparison, the cells in regular breast cancer double every 100 days, where in IBC they double every 10 days. As I said at the start of this video, I feel it is somewhat my duty to inform people of this fact, and whenever I am having a conversation about my mum, I always try to bring into conversation that breast cancer is not always a lump. It's not always the easiest thing to bring up in conversation, but I know if I do, it could change somebody's life. Probably not, but it might. I'm going to leave some information in the description about IBC if you do want to read up more on the signs of it. Thank you for listening to me.